Thanks for joining this TRE hosted Pinnacle webinar on data quality. This time we'll be focusing on addresses and how to ensure your address quality is the best it can be. Your two presenters today are myself, Kevin Smith, and the fact that that slide changed means Paul can hear me as well. Your two presenters today are Kevin Smith, Pinnacle's CIO and Operations Director. And for those who don't know me, I spent a number of years as TRE's Director of Operations for EMEA before starting a consultancy and then joining Pinnacle 2 years ago. Our other presenter, and the most important one since he's responsible for the development of the software you'll see today, and is also our demonstrator, is Paul Knox, Pinnacle's Head of Development. Paul has spent more years than you would care to admit, hey Paul, developing software around PMSs for both suppliers and law firms. So a quick look at who Pinnacle are for those that are unfamiliar with us, with three major areas of focus to our business. Firstly, and this is the area most people who've heard of us will know us for, that's implementation consultancy. Implementing enterprise 3E, Intapp open mergers and all things TRE, additional products such as data insights, workspace. We've been around the TRE partner ecosystem for many years. Secondly, software development. That's the focus of this webinar series, and the software development revolves around largely data quality solutions, toolkit applications, of which today's address cleansing product is but one. Thirdly, managed services. This is a new area of focus to us where we provide our expert knowledge to you on a longer term contracted basis, so you don't have to employ an army of expensive but knowledgeable people internally that are used infrequently. So things like EDG template developers to make 1 or 2 changes to templates a year. We like to think of managed services as de-risking the people element of your business. It becomes our resourcing problem, not yours. So it's a growing area as firms look to outsource their problems to us. We're also partners of a number of different suppliers, of which TRE is our main one, but we are Intapp partners, Microsoft and iManage amongst many others. So a quick look at a numbers slide for those that are unfamiliar. To impress upon you that we operate as a global consultancy for global multinational clients as well as smaller local firms. We are UK based, but we have offices in the US and Europe. We have 80 staff in the UK and 10 in the US. We've been working with 3E and enterprise to 3E implementations since 2010. This webinar is the third of a series of 3, primarily focused on data quality. Initially, we introduced you to entities and sites in 3E and the issues that can come about from conversions and bad data entry, and our solutions that will help you merge and cleanse entity and site data. Secondly, we introduced you to our data quality monitor, a toolkit application that can monitor and proactively report on issues within our 3E, Enterprise, Intapp, or any SQL database. Finally, today we're going to look at our tools for cleansing and ensuring quality address data going forwards. And Paul will be demonstrating this software in a minute. So why do we need correct addresses? Surely most bills are emailed or electronic these days, so why are addresses so important? Well, firstly, we must get the correct country and state information on a bill, particularly where systems such as 3E can drive the tax calculations automatically from a payer's country and state. If that's the case, we'd better make sure the country and state are correct. Additionally, new DAC 6 regulations within the EU require that any cross-border advice is correctly reported to the authorities. If your firm works on a cross-border merger, for instance, You'd need to know the ultimate locations of the parties, the banks involved, etc. Anti-money laundering regulations put the emphasis on you, the firm, to know your clients, know their domicile status and countries of operations. Geographic reporting, not surprisingly, needs correct geographic information. Paul will later demonstrate how geographically based data can be visualized in our tool. And finally, some bills are still delivered as hard copies. And even when they're not, an incorrect address is likely to result in an electronic billing system rejection and delayed payment. So what are the challenges? What were our goals? Well, at the outset, we wanted to make life easier for ourselves in the enterprise to 3E migrations we took on. But as is normal, the scope expanded into Intapp open forms and online lookups in 3E. Primarily, we wanted to be able to cleanse the unstructured data that you find in the various parts of enterprise, which obviously doesn't have country as a lookup or a mandatory field. We wanted to turn that data into something that 3E would allow, and originally every one of our conversion analysts was trying to solve this problem in their own way, in their own conversion code. We wanted a consistent solution. Secondly, we wanted to improve the data capture process in 3E and Open, so only validated data made its way into the database. Thirdly, we wanted to remove duplicates. Often in enterprise, we see the client address has also been keyed in on every matter for that same client. If you convert as is, you get thousands of duplicate addresses. Next, could we handle common abbreviations? UK, GB, Great Britain, United Kingdom. Actually, most people are trying to say the same thing, but in a multitude of different ways. Finally, could we offer some software that overcame the cost of doing all this stuff manually? Correcting hundreds of thousands of addresses manually will not be a cheap undertaking, even with student labour. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Paul and let him loose on the software in detail.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so we've developed tools to attack these problems on two fronts. Firstly, bulk cleansing to clean your existing data and to maintain the quality of those addresses going forward. And secondly, the validation at the point of entry to ensure addresses are correct as soon as they're captured. So firstly, the first of these is our address cleansing tool. It's an automated tool to allow you to identify and clean poor quality addresses. It starts off by first harvesting from any SQL data source, although potentially we could handle any other format. We limit the scope of the data that we bring in using whatever criteria that you can define. And we store what we gather in a separate database on-premise or within your environment. And that's quite a crucial step. We take a copy, so we're not dealing directly with the original addresses, but we keep it within your environment. Secondly, the process then deduplicates addresses for two reasons. One is that we don't want to cleanse an address more than once if we don't need to. And secondly, we need to be able to group together identical addresses so that later on we can give users the option to be able to apply whatever changes they make to all of those addresses if they need to, or to apply the cleansed address back to all of those original addresses. The next step of the process is to actually cleanse those addresses. And we do that by validating against an up-to-date data set of addresses covering more than 240 territories. We score those addresses, both the original versions and the cleansed versions, and then we store them back in the same database on-premise. When they're in that form, they're then available for you to analyze and edit using our web app, which I'll show you in just a moment. This web app allows you to visualize the addresses across the various score bands to filter them based on address information or context information, so the context from which they came, so the entities to which they relate, so the client, the matter, the vendor, so forth. And we recognize that the cleansing process, because it's an automated process, won't be able to cleanse all addresses. Some original addresses may be so poor that there's really not enough information to go on. So we give you the facilities to edit addresses in order to improve them. And for each time you edit an address, we rescore that. And finally, we export those final addresses either back into your source system or into a brand new target system. The second point and the second product is our address lookup, which performs the validation at the point of entry. The goal here is to ensure that addresses are valid right at the start of the process and also when maintaining them manually going forward. We provide type ahead functionality that you will have seen in a lot of websites these days for those user interfaces that support that. And again, we perform the validation against the set of addresses that we have for the 240 territories. We expose this functionality through two standard plugins, one to 3E, the other inside Intapp Open. But we use an extensible architecture, so we provide our address lookup as a service, and that architecture means that we have the potential to use it in a number of different ways, and I'll highlight those in a later slide once we've had a look at the demo, which is, I think, what I'm moving on to next. What's it look like? Okay, so switched over now to a screen that many of you will recognize. I'm inside 3E in the address maintenance form. And I'm going to start searching for an address. So here's a favorite name, firm I used to work for. And it's successfully found 3 addresses in London. You'll have to believe me that these are all actually correct. And that the last one, even though it doesn't actually contain the text I was searching for, is an address at that same, or rather corresponds to one of the addresses that we found and is actually a services company. So actually that's a correct result as well. But I'll select that one. And what we then do is return, we get the full result back, so all the detailed field information about the address, which allows us to put it into all the correct fields within whatever system we're putting the data into. So here we can make sure the zip code goes in the right field and so on. Okay, I'm going to show you another couple of examples, and I'll zip through these quickly. Of course, when people are entering addresses, there's often typos or misspellings, and in this case, you'll have to believe me, it was intentional. What I'm looking for is actually Maple Works, Maple Road down here. And again, we've got the full information back and populated the form. What we're doing currently is we've set the default countries that we're looking at to be the UK and US, but that's a configurable option. For countries that that don't correspond to one of your defaults, then you can specify the country. And I'm just trying to avoid too many typos by copying and pasting in this case. And as you can see, okay, there was a typo in there, but we found the correct address. It's taking into account abbreviations and so on. and in this case it's a French address. Now what we can do as well, although we haven't in this case, is map through the country or some other indicator within the address to the format that it should end up as, although there are a number of other factors that you may want to take into consideration here, so that may not be appropriate. And I'll just leave you with one final example in this area. So a US address. And it's picked up, as you can see, all the relevant information, both the city and crucially the state in this case, because the state is required for the tax jurisdiction information that's required for billing. Okay, so I'm going to leave that interface and then just show you the equivalent Intapp open version. So I'm in an Intapp form here. I've already entered a country in this case, and I'm going to look for some text. Now, as I type, or paste is in this case, it's dynamically going and looking for possible matches. And as I continue to type, it will refine those matches. And a couple of things to point out here. I've started putting it in an English format address with a building number at the start, English version of Rome, but it's been able to resolve that into the correct Italian address. Further to illustrate the different formats of data that we get back through this process, I've given a few examples here. One format might be the address label, correctly formatted according to the target country, so building number at the end, postcode before the town or city, and so on. Or you might want to return it in 3 format, make sure it goes into the correct fields for 3E, or in a more unstructured format that corresponds more closely to enterprise. This is simply to illustrate that we can that we've got enough information and we know which fields are which, so we can put it into whatever format is required for the target system. Okay, I'm now going to switch over to our address cleanse product, and what you see here is the result of us performing the harvest and the cleanse process already. So we've populated an on-premise database with the contents of all of that. And this tool now exposes the results of that harvesting and cleansing process. What we see on the left are all addresses, and on the right, unique addresses. At the bottom, we've got some totals, so we can see how many addresses we harvested, and actually the unique addresses that they correspond to, and some average scores across both. You'll have spotted that the score bands, we've decided on bands of 10, going from worst on the left to best on the right. And what you're looking at here are original addresses. So these are the addresses that we harvested, we haven't cleaned up at all. If I flip onto the cleansed address tab, you can see there's a significant shift over to the right, which is what you would want to see. And you can also spot that there are some differences between the left and right. And this, in the case of this sample data set, illustrates that in the ranges 71 to 80 and 11 to 20, we've probably got a fair amount of duplicate addresses. The final addresses initially look exactly the same as the cleansed, but as you start editing addresses, they'll diverge, and you'll see some changes in the graph. If I click on the I buttons, then we get a summary of how we go about scoring. This just gives you an impression of how we tackle that. So we start off with a total of 100, and we penalise each address based on a large number of criteria. And the sorts of things we're looking for original addresses is how closely they match the requirements of the target system. So if we're going into 3E, we're looking for a country and we're looking for a state if that country requires a state. And we're also looking to see how closely it matches the cleansed address that we end up with. And for cleansed addresses, we're looking at some similar things, but we're also looking at how closely it matches a valid address and also how closely it matches back to the original. So we need to make sure it's both a close match of the original, but that it relates to a valid address. And the finals are similar, but there are some slightly different rules when we consider an edited address. Okay. Up at the top here, we have a section that allows us to filter addresses that you see below. Firstly, we can filter on various properties to do with the address, so any text within it. We can filter by one or more countries. We've got some flags to indicate whether it has been reviewed or has been flagged for follow-up, and we can filter on those. And we can also filter on the basis of whether the address is valid in the target system or not. And we've got some data criteria here to filter on as well. The Where Used tab allows us to filter on properties that are specific to the context from which this address came. So properties to do with the client it was associated with, and so on, and the status of that entity along with data criteria. So straight away, I'm going to start off by having a look for an address for a particular client where I know the client ID. And I'm going to have a look at the unique address for that client. When we drill into any of the bars in the chart, we get taken into this view, which is a grid of matching addresses on the top, and down here the matching, or rather the contexts relating to that address. And in this case, there's only one context, it's the client that I was looking for. If I hover over the I button, then we get an idea about the problems with this address. So the rules that were applied and the penalties that were applied to this address to come up with a final score. And if I click on the edit button, I can now see both the original address, the cleansed address, and the final address. If I go back and have a look at this scoring information, then we can see in this case that a state wasn't identified even though the target country required one, and it's been heavily penalized for that because it makes it an invalid address in the target system. The postcode also wasn't complete. The city was missing, and although it's recognized that it's recognized some text that looks like an organization, it wasn't able to validate that against a known organization at that address. So then just looking at the detail, we've got an address line and part of a postcode and the country, and we've ended up with a standard format for the street. We've got the city and state and the full postcode, and as I just mentioned, it was able to identify something that looked like an organization and put it into the organization field. So just another couple of examples. If I just reset and have a look at all my French addresses. I'm going to have a look at this one. Just drill straight into the form. In this case, the biggest penalty was to do with the country not being identified. And and as you can see, we've got Paris but no country. Country is obviously very significant and makes it invalid in the target system. It's also required so that we can do a good job of matching it to a valid address. Now, of course, Paris, apart from being in France, could be in Texas and probably half a dozen other places around the world. But based on the other information we've got, the validation engine has been able to identify that it is indeed in France. It's in the second arrondissement. And even it's been able to validate the organization, because I think the only penalty we've got is that the fact that the address has been corrected from the original. Okay, so one more example. Look for some text. So in this case, we do have a country, but no state. So we've got some similarities with the first example here, where we've been able to identify the city, state, and full postcode. But there are a couple of things that might confuse some systems. We've been able to identify that the hash 714 is actually apartment 714 because it's been matched against a known address. And it's not be confused by the Bucharest in the first line of the address, which is recognized as an organization. And there's one interesting example here that just illustrates a few of those points. In this case, we have a city in a state capital, but no country. And we've got a couple of pieces of text that may be confusing to an automated system, PL and FL, PL being the ISO country identifier for Poland, and FL, state abbreviation for Florida. But as you can see, it's done a good job of not being fooled and correctly identifying that as One International Plaza, floor 4, Boston, Massachusetts, with a full postcode. Okay, so that's various ways that you might use this filtering section. What you might also like to do is to simply browse through the addresses. And when you do that, what's useful is that you can sort by any of the address fields. So for example, occurrences. And as you select items, you can see the context from where they're used down below. And up here, you can cycle through the various score ranges so that you don't have to leave this screen. So for example, I come back and look for, so if I filter now by some text, I can go and have a look for all my Smiths across my addresses. Or if I'm interested in all my duplicates, then I can filter on the occurrences. And interesting one in this case is that it looks like it's the same client name, but actually there are two different client IDs associated with that address. So this is just perhaps another example by another tool that exposes entities that you might want to go back to your original system to deduplicate. Okay, so that's I think covered how you sort of navigate through addresses using the interface. When you are thinking about pushing the addresses back into either the source or a target system, you'll want to first of all get some confidence that the addresses up the top end to the right of the chart have been cleansed automatically and don't need any more manual intervention. So you might want to do some spot checks up there, but you probably want to focus your efforts down on the left-hand side to the poor quality addresses and see what you can do about those. So if I start having a look at one or two of them down here, in this case you can see, well, there are two organizations apparently, and only part of an address. You can see from the rules we've picked out some some of those issues have been dealt with, or rather identified. But that the score is low for the final address because we haven't really been able to do very much with that. So I think some manual investigation is required, but what I could do is just simply flag that for follow-up so that I can come back later and once I've done my investigation and update that address. I'll have a look at another couple. Again, there seems to be quite a lot going on there, but we haven't got actually a valid postcode, as it turns out. And there are some confusing elements. So it hasn't been able to handle it that well, and I'll flag that for follow-up. In this case, this is one of 50 addresses that are all identical. So whenever I make a change to the final address, I'm prompted to whether I want to apply that change to just this one address or to all copies of it. And in this case, I'm interested in all of them, so I'll say yes to that. Just a last example here where I've got lots of information in the source. I don't have postcode, and it hasn't been able to validate a lot of it. But if I just pretend for the moment that I've done some research and I've actually worked out what this address should be, and I'm happy with that, I can accept that. So I've reviewed it and accepted the changes. And whenever you make a change to an address, we audit that so we know when the change was made by who and exactly what those changes were. If I go back to the grid, you may have spotted as we've been going along that the relevant tick boxes have been ticked. And that allows me, when I come back to this later on, to have a look at, for example, all the addresses that I flagged to be followed up or reviewed. Okay, I think that covers the use. Of course, once you've finished all of that process, you need to come up with some criteria that you're comfortable with that will identify the addresses that we want to push back into the source or into a new target system, which may be a combination of a cutoff point in terms of the score for those final addresses. It might be that, or in combination with some other criteria. But we can control that export process as well. Okay, as a bit of fun, or maybe to keep you awake, I'm going to switch over to a Power BI report that I've just put together to illustrate the point Kevin was making earlier about business intelligence and the quality of data that's required to do any decent geographical analysis. Now, of course, well, what I'm showing you here is purely where the addresses are and the number of them. But what you might use that for is to link it back to financial information, so perhaps where your revenue is coming from. Now, the only use for that is only really useful if you can be sure that the underlying data is correct. So what I'm showing first of all is our original addresses, and as you can see, I don't have any structured information. They're address line 1, 2, 3, and so on. So I don't know where the state or county or city is, or even postcode. They're scattered around. For some addresses, I do have some postcodes and some countries, but they're fairly sparsely distributed. I don't have many. And if I want to drill down into any of these, firstly, it thinks I've got 146 addresses in the UK, and it does take me into the UK. But if I hover over any of them, you can see all I'm able to see are those addresses that do have postcodes, which isn't the entire set. And I can't drill any further. So it doesn't really give me an impression of the distribution of data across or within a region. I think it's probably even worse in our example data, at least, if you're looking at the United States, where you've really got no idea, if you try drilling into that, where your data is, and even trying to drill into explicit address line. This, you may recognize this one from earlier. Doesn't allow me to see whereabouts that is. Okay, so let me switch over to the final addresses. So now you can see that we've got structured information, particular fields that we're populating, and that the spread of postcode and country data is much better. You can see when I hover over, I've actually got 304 addresses in the UK. When I drill into that, it's actually a much more realistic picture. When I hover over addresses, you can see we're now able to split them down by county, so I can see how many I've got in each county. And I can see I've got quite a cluster in London, as you might expect, but also in West Sussex. So I can now drill into West Sussex and see within this area, again, where my hotspots are. And I can see there's a cluster in Chichester. If I did want to drill further down, then I can now drill in down into postcode level. And because I've got a full set of postcodes and those postcodes are actually correct, I can have confidence that I'm looking at the right information. Just to show you that equivalent in the United States, you can see I've got the 9 addresses there, but now I can see how those are distributed. And drilling further down, you can see that I've got my Naked Juice Holdings address pinpointed. Okay, so that's I think that's just about everything in terms of demo. I'm going to flip back to slides just to finish off and show you how it works. So the address lookup, first of all. So I think I've covered some of this in the first slides, but you can see now how it all hangs together. So within the firm, within your environment, we have 2 possible ways of plugging into your systems through 3E or Intapp. And outside of your environment, we hold the validation data and provide a service that performs the lookup and validation of addresses. This means that we can extend it in 2 possible ways. Firstly, we've developed the code to integrate with these applications to call out to a service and do lookups and validation. So potentially we can also then look at using that technology to call out to other third-party data sources like BVD or DMB. And the other aspect is because this is a service, we can also potentially look at providing lookup functionality in other applications within your environment, calling out to the same service. So there are some exciting potential uses in the future. We'll look at the address cleanse process. The key thing again to point out here is that we differentiate between what we store within the firm's environment and what we store within our own environment, and it comes down to responsibilities. We're responsible for the validation data, so we keep hold of that and provide the cleansing process as a service, but we don't, and I should say we don't store your address information either that's coming in or going out. We store those addresses within a database in your environment. So the process starts off with a harvest, where we suck that information in from your source system and store it in this database. We then cleanse it, which involves sending small batches of addresses out to our environment to be cleansed and sent back. Oh, sorry for that. So they're sent back, but again stored in the database on premise. And then it's in a state for you to do the review and edit process, as you've seen from the web application. As you edit the addresses, they're rescored, which does mean a call out and back, and then storing back into your database. And when you're happy with all of that and have defined the criteria that we use to export, then we can export it back into either your target or back into your source database. So that's as it stands today. Roadmap-wise, we've got a couple of things on there. One, these particular features are to do with the editing of addresses within the web app. First, advanced lookup features. You may have spotted on one of the examples that it mentioned there are multiple addresses, multiple possible addresses. So during the cleansing process, we identify sometimes that the address may relate to more than one address, so we can't be sure that it's the right one. And in those situations, we do gather that data and make it available. At least we return it through the service. This item on the roadmap deals with exposing that through the user interface so that you have access to select one of those addresses in that editing dialog. The other aspect of this obviously is to look at plugging in our address lookup functionality within that dialog, where you can do an ad hoc as you type lookup on any address. And the second item here is to show related addresses, in particular in the cases of for example, matter addresses or client addresses where the client has a parent or a related client. We want to be able to show that related address within the edit dialog. So, for example, if you're editing a matter address, you'll be able to see the client address and potentially click a button to be able to use that address. In many cases, it may be the intention that the matter address was the same as the client, but for one reason or another, it no longer is close enough to it in its format to be identified as a duplicate, and we want to be able to, you might want to be able to use that client address on your matter. And the other area is a whole set of improvements around things like extending the context information that we store so that you can filter on it. So perhaps financial information or any other property of the context of that address, dates and so on. So, last build date, things like that. So building that into the model. And then also looking at increasing the number of context types that we're looking at and deriving an indicator so we can tell if an address is relates to an organization or a person, making that flag available for downstream processes. So I think that just about covers it from me, and I'm going to hand over to Kevin to summarize all of that stuff, if he can. Kevin.
Thanks, Paul. So really then to summarize this whole series of 3 webinars that we've put together, they've essentially been our solutions to the problems of creating and maintaining high quality data in your 3E, your open and your enterprise systems. Firstly, as you can see here, we showed you, we have the data quality and address cleansing tools. These help identify the bad data in your SQL-based systems. Secondly, we have the address cleanse and entity bulk merge tools. The idea there is to assist you with the cleansing of the bad data. And then finally, we have the address lookup functionality you've seen today. And we would couple that with some best practice guidance, such as where to put contact information, what constitutes a 3E address, etc. And both of those areas will allow you to avoid any further bad data coming into your systems. So thank you everyone for attending today's and the other 2 webinars. I'm opening it up to questions. We don't have any questions actually on the chat area at the moment. So I'll leave it for a second or 2 just to see if anybody wants to raise any questions. In the meantime, whilst we wait for that, I'll let you know that we will be sending out an email questionnaire to you all. We'd like some input from yourselves on the kind of suggestions that you might have as to where you'd like to see more webinars in the future. We have some of our own suggestions here. So we have started producing an automation tool set called our bots. Basically, the idea is that we have a number of 3E bots which we've developed that monitor different data sources and make automatic postings into 3E. Excuse me, I'll just 1 second. So Paul, there's a question here for you, really, from Mary, asking, as a clarification, where do you get your address data in order to cleanse our addresses that have been requested to be cleansed?
Thanks. So I'm just trying to manage my little chat window to see the questions. I didn't spot that. So the question is, sorry, where do we get the address data? So I guess the answer is it can be from anywhere. So from any system that we, oh, sorry, I don't have the text of the question in front of me, but is the question to do with where do we get our validation data from, or where do we get your source address data from?
I think I'll try and probably pitch in here and try and preempt what Mary's asking for. So Mary, where do we get the address data from? Well, that comes from anywhere, enterprise or any other SQL-based system. Where do we get our validation data from? We have a license with a validated data supplier that also deals with 240 different countries worth of data. So we actually have to pay to provide you with that validated data.
Yeah, well answered, Kevin. Sorry, I still don't see Mary's question in my chat window.
Never mind. Can we move on?
Okay.
Hopefully, I've answered Mary's question. Yes, back to the bots. An idea of what we might want to do next. Automated postings in 3E. So let me take you for an example of one we developed recently, which is an email. You get an email from your bank with an attached remittance advice going to a specific email address in your environment. So what we can do is we can monitor that specific email address. We can parse and analyze the remittance advice. We can identify the client, the invoice, and the amount, and then automatically post the receipt into 3E with no manual intervention. So that's the kind of thing that we think you might want to hear about next. Also, maybe data insights. Data insights has a vast number of uses, so we could do a further webinar on the use of data insights to maximize the value of your data. And as I said, we are actually going to send out an email questionnaire to you all anyway, asking if there's anything else that you'd like to suggest. That's the end of the question. So thanks once again.
Oh, hang on. I've just seen one from Martin. Can both address cleanse and point of entry integration post back to Elite Enterprise? So the answer to that is, firstly, on address cleanse, yes. I mean, that is our initial use case. So that's the area we've been spending time on most recently. So most definitely yes to that one. In terms of the point of entry, the address lookup, we've only got a plugin for 3E currently. If one was required for enterprise, that's something we could certainly look at. As I mentioned, the architecture should support it in terms of providing the ability to perform that function against the service, but we would need to write the plugin itself within the enterprise UI. And that's something we've not looked at yet. I hope that answers that question.
So there was one other question. Can you talk ballpark figures on cost? We have to pay a per individual unique address. We have to pay a license back to the validation supplier for everything that we check. And there is a license cost that we have on the software. It's a monthly license fee. Everything's pretty much done on monthly basis. So if you want to use it for a spurt or clearing up stuff over a few months on an enterprise to 3E conversion, then we'll do that. Then you can have a quiet period, then you can pick it up again, and then when you finally get onto 3E, you can purchase the license for the lookup and hopefully keep your data clean going forward. So I can't really tell you the ballpark figures because it all depends on size of firm, etc., for their monthly licensing fee. But more than willing to have a conversation with you, John. Okay, so that's pretty much it, unless there are any other questions coming up. So thanks once again. If you'd like any more information or any specific conversation, then myself in the UK, Michiel in Europe, and hopefully those of you in the US know Bo. We have the three people who deal with most of the inquiries regarding the data quality and data monitoring toolkit and services. So look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks everyone.